Good afternoon to everybody. So I prefer to start all our meetings in time because in Yale students are coming slowly from around the campus. So let's start sharp. And it's a big privilege for me to welcome exceptional personality with the fantastic diplomatic political career, and now in the United Nations, the German ambassador, German permanent representative to the United Nations, Dr. Christopher Hosgen, who, despite his tough schedule in the Security Council as well, he found the time to visit us and to share on his country vision on the future of the United Nations, on the future of Europe. Dr. Hosgen is exact person to share with us on all these issues because the biggest part of his career he spent it for European affairs. He was in a team drafting and pushing the treaties of the European Union. He was in the Commission on the Arms Control, and then he was advisor to the Minister Kinkel, and what is more important, that for the last 13 years he was the top person in the team of Chancellor Merkel on the foreign policy and security. So Ambassador Hosgen knows the details. We'll try to encourage him to share with us on these details, knowing that ambassadors, they are so limited in the openness, but we have a good, excellent moderator today, Dr. Tom Graham, senior fellow from the Jackson Institute and the acting director of the Kissinger Foundation. Well, and I hope that Tom will put the exact question, well, to satisfy our expectations here. Well, with that, may me to invite Ambassador Hosgen, well, to address you his vision, and then we'll come back to, to the questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I have to correct you at the very beginning. I'm taking time out from my calendar, but not from the Security Council, because we are not in the Security Council, at least yet. And but I come to that. Yes. But thanks very much for being here. Actually, it's my first visit to Yale University. I tried to come here earlier, and that was during my time as a student. I studied actually in Switzerland, and at that time I applied for a scholarship, and I got a scholarship from the Rotary Foundation. The Rotary Foundation gave you a possibility to choose or to tell them which universities you wanted to go to. So I put Ivy League universities and Yale there. And then I ended up at Georgia Southern College in Statesboro, Georgia. I had a wonderful year. It was really a wonderful year to be in Georgia, and I've been back 40 years later, actually over Easter to that area. It's wonderful, but it's not Yale, so I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about the future of the United Nations, the future of the European Union. And I can say that for us, for German politics, the UN and the EU are on the top of our priority list. Why is that? You have to go back to German history to understand why the UN, why the EU are so important for Germany. Because, as you all know, until 1945, in particular the years before, Germany didn't know the rule of law. We had the Hitler period, we had Nazi time, and we all know what Germany caused in Europe and beyond. And after the Second World War, it was very clear, and the Allies made it very clear that Germany should never again behave as it did before in the 30s and 40s. And at the same time also democracy, rule of law, a civil way to resolve crisis is deeply rooted in German post-war generations. This combination that the Allies were very firm, this actually when we had when we wrote our constitution, the German constitution, it had to be checked by the Allies, and they wanted to see that actually democracy is firmly rooted in this constitution, and that democracy, the rule of law, freedom of media, the individual rights are firmly rooted in the constitution. And when you go back in German history now, 20, 30 years actually, the Green Movement, for instance, the movement of civil society had its roots in Germany. We have today still a strong Green Party, a party representing views of civil society. So for us, the rule of law, democracy are very, very important. And at the same time, for us, the European Union is as important. It's kind of the other side of the coin. German democracy, but then also in Europe. In Europe, before the First World War, the Second World War, what ruled was not a situation where you went by law, but it was the country, the politician, the government that thought it would be strongest and had the best army, and then over Germany in particular then did what it did. And this should never happen again. And therefore the founding fathers of the European Union, Konrad Adenauer and Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman and others, for them it was very important that no longer in the future will we resolve the problems between our countries by force, but we want to resolve it by the rule of law, and this is what the European Union is built upon. When you have today a meeting of any body of the European Union, the European Council, the Council of Ministers, working groups, there is always a representative of the legal department present in the meetings, and he or she is quite frequently referred to and has to give his or her opinion of what ministers or civil servants are just about to decide. Is this in conformity with European law? And one of the most influential, strongest institutions in the European Union is the European Court of Justice. So therefore, the rule of law, the lessons of what the lessons of the terrible time led to the Second World War had its conclusions, had its consequences in what Germany tries to represent, of where also the European stands for. And I come to the United Nations, and this is the same thing. The United Nations is, of course, was the result of the Second World War, and where the Allies after the Second War said, well, this what happened before must not happen again, and therefore we set up the United Nations. Germany, which became only member in 1973, we have always been supportive to the UN. We have been in the Security Council of the United Nations every 8 years. We try to contribute to the UN. This is where the one organization where each and every country of this world is represented, 193 countries, and this is where important decisions have been taken. When you look at all the different conventions, resolutions, agreements that have been closed worldwide, this have been under UN auspices. And we think it's very important to promote this, even if, and we just lived through a period again where within the Security Council there are more disagreements than there are agreements, but nevertheless the UN is the most, for us, the most important body, global body, and we need to support this. So for us it is key. We have right now, 2 years ago, the UN General Assembly adopted the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are actually the objectives the world community has set itself to achieve by 2030 in the different areas that are important for mankind, for all continents, for all people. So it is important for Germany. Actually, in 2016, this is the latest figure I have, Germany was the second contributor to the UN system. US number 1 and Germany number 2. It has to do with the fact that we have been supportive of the core budget, but also a number of organizations that belong to the UN family, like the World Food Programme, UNICEF, that are very important, or UNDP, that are very important for us. So, having said that, you will understand that for somebody who for whom the UN is very important, and for whom at the same time, also from a personal background, I spent 5 years before I came here altogether in my life in the US. Transatlantic relations are key for me personally, because also it's thanks to the United States that Germany, after the Second World War, got back on its feet with the Berlin airlift, with support for our constitution, with then the support we had in 1989 when it came to reunification. So of course, and I'm very frank here, it hurts when you have your colleague at the UN, Nikki Haley, last week say that she shares John Bolton's disdain for the UN. So this is something which, of course, is something that you wonder why it's said, and you try to understand, and you try to talk, and I come back to US positions in a minute. So for Germany, the rule of law is very important for its history, but also for the experience in the last 70 years. Also, to add that, when I said we have been always promoting the European Union, we think the model of European Union is something that is worthwhile also for other regions, to have countries in a region join forces and represent themselves. So Germany has always been supportive, starting with ASEAN. We have been supportive for Mercosur, for the Gulf Cooperation Council. We have been promoting the last years in particular the African Union. Actually, the seat of the African Union, Addis Ababa, you have a situation where we have the so-called peace and security building. It's financed by, it was financed by Germany, because we think these regional currents are very important. So for us, this is the general theme for us, we are in favor of a rules-based international order. And this is something that we want to promote, and that we are promoting. And if countries are not following this, we also criticize. And I must say that when you look at the present situation, we are in a situation where the rule of law, the international rules-based order, is under severe strain. And it's not only to please our Ukrainian host here that I start with Russia, and with the fact that Russia during the last years has severely undermined the rules-based international order. In my previous job as National Security Advisor for Chancellor Merkel, I spent the last 4 years most of the time, not most of the time, but a vast amount of time on the Ukraine crisis. And I remind everybody, when also in my country say, well, about Crimea, well, it was a bit dubious, and well, actually it belonged to Russia anyway, so why don't you accept that Russia is now owning, so to speak, Crimea. I tell people that no, actually this is a very severe breach of the international rules-based order. Why? In 1994, and you must have told this, of course, to your students, but in 1994, Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons that were in its territory, and in exchange, Britain, US, and Russia guaranteed in writing in the Budapest Memorandum, guaranteed national sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine, and there is no doubt that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. Actually, people believe, well, actually it's part of Russia. There is even no geographic natural link between Russia and Ukraine. The only natural link is to Ukraine. It was systematically linked to Ukraine. And when after the Soviet Union fell apart, there were polls, there were votes in Ukraine about should they go independent or not, and even on Crimea, a majority was in favor of going to become independent. So, this invasion of Crimea, the crisis that remains in Donbass, is something which is really undermining international law. And this is not the only thing. Our Russian partners, and you follow this right now, again have defend Syria and defend a regime that is undermining international law, is undermining humanitarian law. And you have seen what the allegations against Russia, what they did in England in Salisbury, and this was not the only incident, and what is happening also on cyber attacks for the last 10 years. I still remember 10 years ago when Estonia was almost paralyzed, and since then Russia has systematically used cyberwar to undermine countries. And even in one of my favorite areas, which is sports, Russia systematically violates international sports rule, even from the state. When you see the doping system, it's actually managed by the Minister for Sports. So Russia is something is a challenge. China is a challenge. China is becoming more and more important. You follow probably also what is happening in the area, the South China Sea, where China is also systematically violating international law, the law of the sea. When you look at China itself in domestic politics, you see how it violates also the humanitarian, the human rights conventions, dealing with minorities, dealing with lawyers, dealing with journalists, dealing with NGOs. And what happened 3 weeks ago in the National Congress, when President Xi was then invited, so to speak, no longer to limit his mandate. We even go back to a reform that Deng Xiaoping, I think, then introduced, and that is that the president should have only limited terms and then should be replaced in kind of a democratic way, but should be replaced by somebody else. So China is going into a direction with regard to also this prolongation of presidencies, which we have in other countries. We have that in Africa, in Burundi, we have it in Rwanda, we have it in Congo. Even Russia didn't go that far. President Putin, after 2 times as president, went as prime minister and then came back. So at least the constitution was adhered to. So backsliding from the rule of law, we have this unfortunately in many areas. We are following with concern what is happening in Europe or with our NATO partner Turkey. Until today, I have not heard a reasoning which I can follow for the intervention in Afrin. when you look at the domestic situation, the rule of law, when you see how systematically the judicial system was undermined, Turkey is the country with the highest number of journalists in prison. When you look at how the media freedom is undermined, it makes you very nervous. We can go around the world. Philippines was also a democratic country where the rule of law was looked at, and when you look today at the way that Duterte implements his legal system, you get headaches. Myanmar, you all follow this, the UN Special Representative or Representative for Human Rights has described what happened to the Rohingya as genocide. And we have discussed before, or I mentioned Syria, so what is happening there also is of course against the rule of law. Unfortunately, and I have to come back to host country, to the US, there has also been some, from my perspective, worrying developments. I mentioned the remark that Nikki Haley made last week. I received an email by her in December when in the General Assembly the resolution was on the agenda about President Trump's decision to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And so I received a message from my colleague, and she said, well, we want you to vote against this resolution, and if you don't vote for this resolution, I will report you to the president. And Germany voted yes, and I had a long conversation with her afterwards to explain to her that this was the mail that I received from her was something that I was very sad about, because actually it was against what the Americans had always told us. You have to go by the rule of law. And I explained to her there is a Security Council Resolution 478, a binding resolution where the US at the time abstained, where it is said no embassy should go to Jerusalem, and those embassies in Jerusalem, and there were actually some 17 embassies in the 60s there, should move, or the 70s should move out. So she asked me to actually violate international law. So this is something that we regret. We regret that the US is leaving the Paris Agreement, that the US President Trump has and is on the verge of actually now leaving the Iran nuclear deal. Iran nuclear deal, which is from the nuclear watchdog in Vienna, it said that Iran is adhering to this deal. I mean, I don't say anything about Iranian behavior in the region, but this deal they adhere to, and by then saying that this is not happening, then and if the US would leave the Iran deal, this would again be something where say, well, there is an agreement that was taken between the EU and 6 countries, and US just leaving it. The disrespect for the World Trade Organization, something that is very worrying. I must say, though, I became National Security Advisor in 2005. One of the first issues we had also with the then government Bush was Guantanamo, where we also told also our American friends this is something where we believe the US should observe international law, and this is not in accordance with the international humanitarian law. So having a president criticizing the fake news and fake New York Times and fake CNN, something where we believe the freedom of the media, of the press is something actually sacred. This is also something which hurts, and criticism, and we have been following this these last days, the criticism of the judicial system is also something for, in a democratic country where you have the division of powers, is something that you are not very happy about. So what are the consequences of all of this? Having listed all the negative developments, one would say, well, why don't you give up? Germany, and maybe I'm too old and not open enough for other alternatives. Germany will defend and do everything to defend international rules-based order, and this is also why We are campaigning for the Security Council. We have in June a vote to go into Syria for 2 years. We want to see that as member of the Security Council we can do and contribute to the implementation of what we stand for. In general, we work very hard to reform the Security Council and we reform the UN. We support Secretary General Guterres in his efforts to reform the organization, and we are also in favor, as I said, to reform the Security Council. Let me go back to the European Union. I told you at the very beginning that for us, after the Second World War, with our Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who was kind of the hero of my childhood, that we were always in favor of strengthening the European Union. We know that there are challenges. When I turn and criticize in other continents, countries, I also have to criticize within the European Union some member countries, what is happening in Hungary, what is happening in Poland with regard to the freedom of media, also with the respect for the judiciary. This is something that is very negative, and we support the European Union, in particular our Commissioner Timmermans, who is working on this and implementing and trying to get European rules implemented. But I must say, at the European Union, also those who wrote and agreed upon the treaties never thought that what for us was basic in Europe, democracy, rule of law, etc., could be put into question by members in the European Union who, when they became members, like the East Europeans, had to fulfill the so-called Copenhagen criteria where the rule of law, democracy was fully enshrined. So we have our negative developments, but still we have a lot of populism in Germany. We have right-wing parties. Also in my country, I could never imagine with our history that we would have a right-wing party, which in recent polls has some 13–14%. So what do we have to do? We have, of course, as in the US, you have to see to it that you look after the concerns of the people, of the concerns of every people, not only of a certain very educated class, but you have to look at the grassroots and have to see what are they concerned about. They're concerned about security. In Europe now many are concerned about immigration, and you have to see to it that you resolve that you see that internal security is given. You have to look at external security, and of course you have to be sure that there are enough jobs created. Therefore, one of the issues during the whole Euro crisis, which was always very important for the Chancellor, she was criticized very much for this, was always to see to it that the countries in crisis would not get unlimited amount of financial support, but that they had to undergo reforms, because in globalization we need to have economies in Europe that are competitive within Europe, outside Europe, to create jobs, to see that there is a future in globalization, because I don't think that you can close your doors and cannot participate in globalization. So it is very important that internal security, close control of outer borders, external security. Actually, when you conduct polls in Europe, you'll find that a strong majority is in favor of a common foreign security policy of Europe. So we have to go into this direction, and as said, we have to be competitive. And there, I come back to what was very important at the outset of the European Union, when we had President Charles de Gaulle in France and Konrad Adenauer in Germany. They sealed the German-French partnership relationship, and this German-French couple has always worked, and we are, I must say, very happy about President Macron in France, who is right now facing, of course, some criticism for his reform process in France, but we wish him every luck. We want him to be successful. We want French economy to be successful, when French and Germany are in sync and reform. I think that will be the basis also for a strengthening of the European Union, which we believe very, very highly in. We had in Berlin the day before yesterday, and actually today, retreat of the cabinet of the new cabinet of the new ministers. It took a long time to form a coalition this time, and the Chancellor in our press conference afterwards this morning said the most important issue for us is Europe. So this, you see that this remains a priority for us. Let me go back to transatlantic relations here. I worked for many years with my counterparts in Washington, and we had a very good relationship, including with the outgoing security advisor McMaster. He wrote a piece together with Cohen, the economic advisor. Both are gone now. They wrote a piece, I think, in the Wall Street Journal half a year ago, where they described the world as an arena, and you have to fight within in the arena, it's kind of a lose-win situation. And my argument with him was, and this is also the remark I want to close with, I think transatlantic relations, global relations, there is still hope for a win-win situation. There are in all areas. You can come to agreements where both sides in the end are winners, and this will be also something that we will try to work on in case we are voted into the Security Council. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks very much for listening, and now we go into a discussion. But before we do that, we have to say how the Champions League ended. 0-0. Thank you. Is that a good result? It's a very good result. Very good.
Happy to hear. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for I think that very comprehensive overview of the German vision of the world. A lot on the UN, a lot on the European Union, on the transatlantic relationship. The one entity that I didn't hear mentioned or talked about in any detail was NATO. And I wonder if you could give us sort of the German view on NATO now as an institution. It lies, from the Washington standpoint, at the core of the transatlantic relationship.
Well, sorry for leaving this out. Of course, NATO has been instrumental in preserving peace in the post-war era, and we have, of course, after '89, the question was, well, what is the importance of NATO? And then we saw after September 11, and then the engagement of NATO in Afghanistan, and then with what I mentioned, the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine, the threats also against the Baltic countries, and there NATO has come again to play a very important role. And when I was concentrating more on the questions of the rule of law and the rule of order, NATO, of course, plays a very important role. We are criticized for not living up to the so-called 2% goal. You would come to that, so I do a preemptive strike here. Jokingly, I always say I hope for the next big recession in Germany, because then we can quickly reach the 2%. But this is, of course, not serious. We have been increasing our expenditure, but at the same time, the last 10 years, we have had constant rise of our GDP. So even by raising the defense budget, we have only minimally come closer to the 2% goal. We have a coalition government. It is extremely difficult. I'm a member of the Christian Democratic Party, to convince our social democratic friends to agree to these kind of the basis you would need to get there. The last coalition agreement has something very interesting, and there is a compromise that said that when we come to, and we have had that these last years, budget surpluses, actually we have budget surpluses in Germany, then the money will be spent evenly on development policy and on military. Because we deeply believe that there is no crisis, no conflict in this world that you can resolve with military means alone. So you can, of course, go and bomb, and then you go out, and then you have the big mess, and then you have terrorists coming up. So you always have to go in and see to it that you join these forces. And when it comes then to the ODA, so the development assistance, actually we met last year or the year before, we actually met the international 0.7% goal, which had to do a lot with the refugees that we accepted. So this year we are a bit below, but far beyond, if I may say so, the United States, which is at 0.15%. So there is a certain balance.
I appreciate that. We've had this discussion before with our European colleagues. Let me turn back to the European Union for a minute. You mentioned Poland and Hungary. I mean, the concerns about the backsliding of the rule of law. We just saw over the weekend Orban party being re-elected, likely several more years of this. And it's been going on in Poland for 4 or 5 years now as well. What is the European Union doing at this point that gives you confidence that eventually, as you bring both Hungary and Poland back to something that is more compatible with what you see as European values at this point?
It's a very good question. I partly tried to answer it. I think that in the end, Europe as such will not be able to change this. Why? Because in Europe we are still sovereign nations, and while the European Union in the commercial area, or when you have mergers, or when you have the laws on certain within the internal market, they don't correspond to, then you go to the Court of Justice, and then the ruling is, and their general, I think, absolute majority of cases, everybody then adheres to it. When it comes to the issues that you raise, I mentioned when the judiciary is weakened, when you get rid of, you have the freedom of media. The first thing that happened in Hungary yesterday was that the opposition newspapers just finished its publication. So what can you do? I think in the end it has to come out of the countries themselves. Poland is the country where actually much of what happened in Eastern Europe, the end of the communist system, started with Solidarność, with Pope Jean Paul II and Jean Paul II. And I just cannot imagine that the Polish society, who has stood up against the Soviet Union, who has actually started to get rid of the Iron, they are ready to go back to a situation where you have no rule of law and no freedom of media, etc. Of course, what we have to do in our countries, and this is also something, I'm an observer, but you have to see, on the one hand, you have in the US also, you have New York, you have Warsaw, but you have the landscape, you have the villages outside, and some suffer more than others. On the other hand, in Poland, the Polish farmers, for instance, are the biggest benefiters from the European system. So, but still out there. In Hungary, same thing. Orban is actually much further in his efforts to see to it that, and he said himself, I want to have an illiberal democracy, where he has streamlined it. And of course, the opposition in Hungary, when you go back to the socialists, they never really broke with the the communist parties, and they have a legitimate problem. And then Orban was able to split the opposition. Still, I'm a good friend. I don't know if he has a good reputation or not. I'm a good friend of George Soros, who is somebody there who has been, and the way how in Hungary Soros was used in the election campaign, it's incredible. And that this gets through, this is accepted there as well. And so what is my hope? I hope is that out of the societies, young generations will say, no, we want to have our freedom, we want the rule of law, we don't want to corruption, we want to read what we want to read, and I hope that this will succeed.
So, I mean, you're betting that there's still strong civil societies in both these countries that will eventually push the politics back in a direction that is more consistent with what you would like to see happen.
Yes.
Let me turn to another sort of problem area in Europe that lies outside the EU at this point. The Western Balkans have received, I think, greater attention over the past several months, in part because the sense that there's growing instability, potential for instability there, concerns about what Russians might be doing in the Western Balkans. But I also think there's a sense in Europe, and to some extent in Washington, that we let the Western Balkans down. We had a tremendous push in the 1990s, put in process a lot of good types of developments and reforms, and then lost interest. What is the policy now of the German government in particular on the Western Balkans?
Yes, you're absolutely right. We all followed the horrific, horrible Balkan wars after the breakup of Yugoslavia, and after Dayton, after Kosovo crisis ended. People said, okay, now now we can turn back into our internal affairs. And at the same time, in the early 2000s, what you had was the enlargement process. So the enlargement process to the east. So everybody was concentrating on the east, the Baltic countries, the Visegrad countries, Cyprus, all this. And at that time, everyone was concentrating on the Balkans, and they were neglected. I agree with you. One decision was taken in 1999, and this is a key decision. I'm not even sure that we could take it today. There was a European Council in Thessaloniki in 1999, where all the Balkans countries were given a European perspective. So all of these countries, sometimes, for instance, right now the European Union is not ready to give to countries like Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia, to the same extent that they've given it to the Balkans. Also take into consideration how the quick enlargement. Mentioned Hungary and Poland worked. So, but on the Balkans, so this is one thing. And then the Chancellor 4 years ago saw exactly what you said. She then started the so-called Berlin process, where once per year all the heads of government come together of all Balkan countries, including Kosovo, where they discuss among each other with Germany, the European Union, and then we have a series now. We had it in France, we had it in Austria, we had it in Italy, we have it in Britain this year, and there is a so-called Berlin process. And we started a bigger economic cooperation between them. We have now what we have from the German-French Youth Office. We have now Balkans Youth Office that we promoted. The Academy of Sciences are working together, and so we are working very hard. The former High Representative for European for External Policy, the European Foreign Minister, so to speak, Cathy Ashton, engaged tremendously in the Balkans. She got the dialogue going between Kosovo and Serbia, and got actually this with some very practical, positive decisions. So there is focus on the countries. Still, they need to reform, and the problems that we have in these countries are, again, that the democracies is there. Yes, rule of law, corruption, real problem, freedom of media, etc. We have to work on this, but we have to pay attention because other countries are not waiting. Our Russian partners are in the Republic Srpska. They are very present in Serbia, and Montenegro, and Macedonia, and so we have to be very active. Actually, also some Islamic countries are there. Turkey is active. So European Union has to be present. We also have to get used more and more to the fact that our American friends are not. The days of Holbrooke, who single-handedly solved some of the problems, and we Europeans were not able to do it. It needed the Americans. Today, we don't have a Balkans envoy in the State Department. One of the Obama administration lost his job, and so there is, of course, I do accept that Europe has to resolve the problem on its continent, but some U.S. support, and maybe when we have a new Secretary of State, this will again be on the agenda. We need to work on that.
Okay, but the vision still is to include the Western Balkans at some point in the future into the EU.
We are negotiating with Montenegro.
Serbia.
We are negotiating with Serbia. Albania is on the verge. We are pushing very much on the Macedonian language issue that allowed Macedonia. No, we are pushing it. But I must admit, if you conducted a poll today in Europe, should we have new countries joining the European Union, I would say the majority would be against that.
Right. Part of the problem you have with populism and so forth. Let's talk about Russia. What are we going to do about Russia? I mean, we all know that it's a challenge now, that it is certainly not a rule of law society, certainly when it comes to international affairs. Multiple challenges to the West at this point. How do we manage this relationship? And do you see a united transatlantic approach to Russia at this point? One of the problems that we have different views inside the transatlantic community is how to deal with this big and important neighbor.
I don't necessarily agree with you that we have a difference of views. I must say, during the time I was responsible in the Chancellor's office for the so-called Minsk process with the negotiations with, together with my French colleagues, with Ukraine and Russia for that matter. There was Toria Nuland was the Assistant Secretary, and we had excellent cooperation. Now one of the things that the Chancellor asked President Trump early on to continue this cooperation, and Kurt Volker was nominated, somebody we know from the Bush administration, and he does a remarkable job, and we are actually working hand in hand. So no complaints whatsoever. I think this is very good. I think our Russian partners saw it at some stage to drive a wedge between us there, but no chance. No, we have to stay with our principles. We have to if Russia violates international law, we have to stand to this and be very clear. And sanctions help. At the same time, we always have to talk to the Russians. We always have to see, is there a possibility to find a solution? I never thought 5 years ago that one of the European cities I would know best by the end of my time as National Security Advisor would be Minsk, because I went there many times for these negotiations, even if it was it didn't yield a lot, but it was very important to sit at a table and see can we find common ground, and can we move forward. So we should always continue to do that. I always believe that Europe and Russia are, to a certain degree, natural partners, that you can work together. We had offered a number of partnership agreements and wanted to engage in this, but I think what we underestimated was the fact that the end of the Soviet Union, which was seen, of course, by many as the beginning of paradise, by many Russians, in particular also by President Putin, was seen as he has said, the biggest catastrophe was the end of the Soviet Union. So this pride and then his ambition to actually recreate recreate Russia. Maybe we have realized it too late, but we are then always said, well, you know, why did you have to give an association agreement to Ukraine? And so why don't you accept that Ukraine is part of the Eurasian Union? There I must say, I mean, who are we as Germans who brought, you know, so much terror, so much suffering to countries like Ukraine? Who are we to tell Ukraine, sorry, you are geographically in the wrong place, you cannot have an association with the European Union? What maybe we have done at the time, but I mean, you're a better place to say that, maybe at this time the European Commission should have worked even harder to see how an association agreement with Ukraine is compatible with this thing that's called Eurasian Economic Union. But nevertheless, in the end, it's about the choice of the people. And who are we to tell Ukrainians, listen, you have to stay? So I think this is what we have to make understand, and we have to fight for and represent. But at the same time, as I said, Russia with its vast resources, with a huge country, there is so much possibility to work together that I would never give up hope that we get them back into the G8, that we work together again.
Let me one specific question on this. So it's interesting to see how German policy works toward Russia. On March 27th, Germany expelled 4 Russian diplomats, along with other European countries. The United States also expelled diplomats, largely because of the Skripal case in Salisbury in the UK. That same day, the German government gave the final permission to begin construction of the Nord Stream, which the Ukrainians oppose, the United States oppose, because they see this as increasing European dependence on Russian gas resources, and also undermining Ukraine's ability to act as a transit and therefore support itself economically. So, 2 different elements of a Russian policy. How do those fit together in the mind of the German government?
Yes, not an easy answer to give. First, let me begin more general. Germany and Russia have always had in history a close, sometimes closer, some less closer, something complicated, sometimes less complicated history to each other. And Germany brought, I was talking about what happened in Ukraine. When you look at the victims, Hitler, German Nazi, the victims in Russia were 20 million people that were killed. So you feel also then that you are guilty towards Russia, the Russian population. So you want to have a good relationship. And even Adenauer, who was a firm transatlanticist, very firm transatlanticist. Nevertheless, he traveled to Moscow, he negotiated with them, he got the last German, 10 years after the war, the last German war prisoners out, and during the Cold War there was a deal with Russia on some steel pipelines, steel pipes, so there was always this relationship. And within the German government, when you have coalition governments, the last ones with Social Democrats and Christian Democrats, you have one party that is standing more for this relationship than the other. The former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, today is in the board of Gazprom. So you see that this is part of. So when the Nord Stream 2 decision came up, the Chancellor rightly said, well, we see this as this was signed here, this is a commercial undertaking. If it's if it is compatible, if it's an agreement with the EU laws, we will not veto it. And so we went through the EU procedure. We now all the countries from the Baltic countries to Sweden, and really they have to see is this compatible with their environmental law, etc. And I think we are not, for those who are very much in favor of this pattern, we are not there yet. We are not there yet. There is still some. At the same time, also in the retreat of the cabinet, the Chancellor said at the press conference this morning that, of course, we have to have a solution where gas transit through Ukraine will remain, so that Ukraine will continue to benefit. I must say one thing, because, of course, I've criticized here as a representative of Germany out in the US for this. I would love that American, and there are big American companies now, you export a lot of gas. Why don't our American friends look into the possibility of building a liquefied gas terminal in Germany? We don't have that yet, and there's one in Rotterdam, there's one in Russia. Why not try to invest into? And Germany's biggest energy market. Why not get Exxon or something, build a terminal for liquefied gas, and you can export some of the American gas to Europe and compete.
Not a bad idea. We'll take that up. I want to pose one final question before we turn to the other people here participating in the discussion. Syria, obviously a very topical issue at this point. United States is clearly considering military options at this point. Where is the German government on this? Would you be supportive of a military option at this point? And would you actually participate in one to deal with what we see as the violation of the Chemical Weapons Treaty, Russia's complicity in what is a horrifying humanitarian disaster in Syria?
We are, when you look at the humanitarian situation in Syria, it's a nightmare. When you see how Russia is either participating or allowing Syrian forces to treat its own population the way it does, it's just horrifying. So there needs to be an international response. The United States and allies tried very hard to get Security Council to move on this, and the vote yesterday, I think it was 12 yes votes. Russia vetoed, and I think China and Bolivia abstained. So what needs to be done? When you look, I mentioned before the rule of law, and what is then for a military intervention, what is the legal basis for this? And we are on very thin ice there. There is the right to protect. We go back to the situation in Kosovo in 1999. Kofi Annan at that time, there was a lot of discussion about humanitarian interventions and legal, and I think that legal advisors, when they look at the situation, get great hair. So on this, first of all, Germany will not participate, because for a military intervention we need a vote of our parliament, and in our constitution it is written that you can only use force when you do this either on the mandate of the UN, of NATO, or the European Union, or you do it on Article 51, but none of that would be given. So Germany, for legal reasons, cannot. On the other hand, just to see this happening and really see these pictures, this is just horrible. So I think there would be a political understanding for a military reaction.
Okay, I want to turn to all of you to see if you have any questions. If you do, please raise your hand. If you could identify yourself. We have a microphone over here that you need to. Can we have someone convey the microphone as well? Good. And if you just state your name and a short question. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. So right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Mito Martin. I'm a dual citizen, Federal Republic of Germany and United States of America. Two topics. You haven't mentioned Brexit, so what are your thoughts how that drama is going to come to a conclusion? The other topic that I would like to hear your thoughts is, what is the story of this two-speed Europe now that the Visegrad member states basically are only interested in the dissemination of funds and perhaps the single market? Why not force the two-speed Europe? Okay, thank you.
Yes, first on Brexit, I think it will happen. I don't think that the British people will come back on that decision. I hope that the negotiations will come out in a way where you have an amicable divorce, which also means that Great Britain will not be just any third country, but that Britain will remain very close to the European Union. Talking to many of my British colleagues and those British friends, this is what their ambition is also. And we see this in the UN, in the European Union. From a German perspective, Great Britain has always been very close to us. Also when it comes to market economy, to free markets, to free trade, when it comes to economic discipline, when it also comes to Britain's role in security and defense, they bring something to the table. So Germany has every interest to keep it close. We were, nevertheless, after the decision, and the Chancellor was very unhappy about her saying is, we don't have. She has always resisted all efforts in Germany to come to referenda. Says, don't ask a question when you cannot live with the answer. And why we have I talked about the allies looking at our constitution. We have representational democracy, and so I think we see some advantages. So I hope that this will not be a disaster, but that we stay together. On a two-speed Europe, I think we don't have an interest in promoting a two-speed Europe, because if you have then Europeans in different configurations, it is very, very difficult. I think it's very good for Europe to speak with one voice and to speak with for 28. But the European treaties allow for this two-speed Europe. We actually have it already now with the euro. You have it with Schengen. So we will have actually, now we have so-called reinforced cooperation in security and defense. I think 25 countries said we want to go further in this area. And so you will have in practice kind of a two-speed Europe, but it's nothing that one would promote, because in the end, the best thing would be for 28 countries or 27 to stick together, speak with one voice, and be a joint force.
Question over here.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me? I can't tell. I'm thinking of the reunification of Germany. And I believe Gorbachev was promised that NATO would not be extended. That's correct, right? Because I've heard the participants discuss it.
No.
I'm trying to ask a question. Can I just continue and ask the question? So, in any case, we know NATO was extended to the borders. And I'm asking, how do you think that makes Putin feel about dealing with the West when it comes to having agreements? And what kind of threat does he see? Kissinger said that we're misunderstanding Putin in this respect. And I'm asking you to comment on NATO's expansion and what kind of instability that could possibly cause.
First, to clarify, there was no agreement whatsoever for. Yes, this is always said. And
say that he was there and heard Lawrence Wilkerson, who's Colin Cowell's executive. I heard him on YouTube saying that.
Yes, but this doesn't make it more true. What is, and actually Gorbachev has said it himself, that there was no agreement. There is one agreement, and that is that should be on the we don't have, there should be no permanent NATO base in East Germany or in the other countries, so that while all of Germany belongs to NATO, there is no NATO base in East Germany. The extension to the borders and dealing with the West. I mean, I come back to the response, what I said earlier with regard to Ukraine. If a country that has lived under Soviet oppression, and I mean, when you look at the situation in the Soviet Union, what it meant for the Baltic countries, part of them were almost extinguished. Half of the Baltic population had left. When you look at how the Soviet Union, when they tried in Prague, when they tried in Budapest in Hungary, or even in East Germany to demonstrate and to get rid of a communist system, how they crushed that with the tanks. For these countries to say now we are freed of communism, that we want to become member of NATO so that this doesn't happen again in history. I mean, who are we Germans who are here to tell them, no way, Poland, you cannot become member of NATO and be defended by NATO. So therefore, we have offered Russia after unification, after the end of the Cold War, to work together with us. We have the NATO-Russia Council, we have the NATO-Russia Founding Act, where actually we want to have a cooperative system with Russia, but this was not the perspective that Putin had. So he, as I said, he said that the worst what ever happened was the end of the Soviet Union, and he thinks that the ambition for Russia should be to re-establish somehow the Soviet Union. And I think we have to defend our freedom, and we have to defend the freedom of those countries that lived under oppression under the Soviet Union, and we have to defend that.
You might have misunderstood my question. I'm saying we have missiles on the Soviet border, and I'm asking what kind of instability and threat do you think that is engendered in Russia? It's that that is speaking about. I'm not speaking about freedom. I'm talking about missiles all around Soviet border in Eastern Europe. And I'm asking what kind of instability and threat is engendered.
Well, the instability that you basically have are those countries that are not member of NATO, so to speak. And when you look at Georgia, when you look at Moldova, when you look at Ukraine, you can see that Russia has taken over parts of their countries and tried to have a foot in the door there, and to see to it that they influence the development of the country. So, and this is very, very unfortunate. So that this is happening.
Other questions? Question over here.
Yeah, I was wondering about the Visegrad countries again, particularly Hungary, and how does Merkel and his party during this time with regard to this? I mean, Chancellor Merkel's Christian Democrats stand in the European Parliament together with the Orban's Fidesz party together and with the European People's Party, which is sort of the central-right party, largest party in the European Parliament. And German MEPs from Christian Democrats seem to be quite okay with this region. There's no attempt to expel the Orban's party from the European People's Party. And I was wondering, there are two explanations usually given to this. One is the sort of the pragmatic one that the European People's Party relies on Fidesz for votes in the European Parliament, whether it goes through application on 5% of the European Union budget. And the other one is more of a sort of think that maybe there is actually some sort of ideological sympathy among the German Christian Democrats towards the Fidesz and what Mr. Robert is doing. I was wondering what's your take on that issue?
Well, I'm not a spokesperson for the European People's Party. I can only see this from the outside. When you look at the European party families, you could say that in all party families you have, so to speak, black sheep, and There are many parties member of these, and the parties have to calibrate how best to handle this. You know? Do you keep them in the party family and exercise some influence on them, or do you expel them and then they are outside and then they may become very radical and not be part of majorities that you have to find. I must say that, so it's not for me to respond to that. A result of all this is that when it comes to very tough decisions in the European Union, when it comes, for instance, one of the issues we've been discussing, the relations to Russia, we talked to the invasion in Ukraine. Until now, it has always been possible to get also Hungarian support for the extension or the raising of new sanctions, maintaining in particular the sanctions against Russia because of the invasion of Crimea. And this is not automatic. There are many who doubt that. But when you're part of a family, then it's easier to get your family members to go along with these decisions. But right, you have a very legitimate question there in what the party family stands for. But what I want to say that within, because I'm a member of but only as not a senior member, just a normal party member of the Christian Democratic Party. The Christian Democratic in Germany does stand for democracy, the rule of law. The chairman of the CDU is Chancellor Merkel, and I think one cannot say that she has any intention to go into this direction.
We have time for one more question. I'm going to go right down here.
Thank you. My name is Myron Melnick, and I have a question about Ukraine. We know that in recent years, in the last 4 or 5 years, with the forceful annexation of Crimea and the instability in southeastern Ukraine, we know that the population in Ukraine has become very security conscious. And of course, there is an existing association agreement now with Europe. But recent polls indicate that solid majorities now in Ukraine, eastern, western, central Ukraine, are in favor of further integration into Europe and eventual membership in the EU. And even healthy majorities now have emerged in favor of membership in NATO. So this is a dramatic change forced by the security concerns in recent years. So my question is, what impediments does Germany see towards further integration of Ukraine into the EU and maybe eventually into NATO? And similar question with respect to the EU. What impediments exist for further integration?
Yes. First, let's start with the European Union. Ukraine, over the last years, has gradually come closer to the European Union. You remember that the question, should it have an association agreement or not, brought the Maidan, because then Yanukovych government decided against that, and then the Maidan happened, and a new government was then voted that was in favor of the association agreement. So we have the association agreement, we have visa liberalization, so there have been a number of steps taken. At this stage, on the one hand, the European Union itself is I mentioned this earlier when we discussed the Balkans, the European Union is very reluctant when it comes to new members, and as I said, we are still digesting the last enlargement. We are working with the Balkan countries, so right now there is a certain reluctance. At the same time, there are the European treaties where it says that every European country can apply for membership, so this possibility is always there. I think that before Ukraine can become member, a lot of things have to happen in Ukraine. Ukraine is going into the right direction, but when it comes to the rule of law, when it comes to the judicial system, when it comes to the fight against corruption, when it comes to good governance, there are still a lot of steps to be taken. So EU membership is not for tomorrow, but this EU association agreement offers a lot of chances, actually the integration into the internal market. So economically, and I've already seen a switch in the orientation of the Ukrainian economy from much more towards the European Union than to Eastern Europe and Russia for that matter. On NATO, the discussion about Ukraine becoming member is an old one. That was already the main subject in the NATO summit, I think in 2008, when the discussion of membership action plan was raised at the time. There is a paragraph in the NATO rules which says that each new member should contribute to the stability of the organization. And what, as a NATO member, you don't want to do is to bring within NATO a conflict, which could, and let's be very honest, which with a membership of Ukraine, and Ukraine could invoke Article 5, and you have NATO fighting Russia over Crimea. So this is something which right now is on the agenda, which does not mean that with regard to the relations with NATO, they have not over time been becoming closer and closer with a lot of training missions, with exercises, with the exchanges between NATO and Ukraine have gradually increased over time.
Mr. Ambassador, you've been very generous with your time. We appreciate your spending this time with us.